On a gray September morning, the sheriff of Bennett County stood by the roadside, clutching his cap with both hands, his face drawn and pale. Reporters crowded around him, demanding answers, yet all he could repeat was that an investigation was underway. But the truth had already slipped out. Deep within a stretch of dense forest, hunters had stumbled upon something no one could explain. Resting between tall pines, its white paint flaking but its form intact, was a small fishing boat named Annabelle, a vessel that had vanished without a trace during a violent storm back in 1993. There was no road that led there, no evidence of heavy machinery, no drag marks on the ground. It simply stood there, as though it had been carefully placed by invisible hands. 18 years had passed since it disappeared beneath the raging sea, and now, impossibly, it had reappeared far from the shoreline, miles inland. How could a boat lost to the ocean be found in the heart of the woods, untouched by salt or storm? And more haunting still, what had become of the two men who once sailed her into the dark waters that night? The story of the Annabelle begins on an overcast morning in late October 1993. The weather along the coast was unsettled, the sky thick with cloud, though the sea still held a deceptive calm. Jonathan Hill and Mark West, two local fishermen who had known the ocean all their lives, prepared their small vessel for what they believed would be another ordinary day at sea. They cast off from the harbor before dawn, their boat, with its modest wooden hull and white-painted sides, cutting through the early mist. Fishing was their livelihood, and with no warnings issued by the Weather Service, they had no reason to suspect that the day would mark the beginning of a mystery that would haunt their community for decades. By midday, however, the horizon had darkened. Winds that had begun as playful gusts quickly grew into howling squalls. The sea swelled beneath them, waves rising higher with each passing hour. By the afternoon, the Weather Service had finally issued a storm warning, but by then it was far too late. Out on the open water, Jonathan and Mark fought against a storm that turned the ocean into a churning, merciless force. The last transmission from the Annabelle came at 4 o'clock that day. The words were faint, distorted by static, but just audible. "We're leaving the bank. We're not holding our course." And then, silence. That evening, the coast was battered by a hurricane-strength tempest. Waves climbed to 6 meters, the kind that could break even larger ships apart. When no further word came from the Annabelle, the Coast Guard attempted to send out rescue boats, but they were forced back. The sea itself had become too violent, too dangerous for even trained crews. The search had to wait until the storm subsided, and by then, precious hours had already been lost. In the days that followed, the shoreline was combed relentlessly. Helicopters swept overhead, ships were questioned, the waters searched again and again, yet not a trace of the Annabelle appeared. There were no life rafts bobbing in the waves, no oil slicks drifting in the current, no shattered planks carried in by the tide. The sea, vast and unyielding, had swallowed both the boat and the men as though they had never been there at all. Legally, a year later, both Jonathan Hill and Mark West were declared dead. Their families held memorial services, quiet affairs in small churches, filled with the heavy grief of lives cut short and questions left unanswered. A black-and-white photograph of the Annabelle, its name painted proudly on the bow, was pinned to a notice board in the harbor. For years, it hung there, gathering dust, a fading reminder of a storm that had taken 2 men and a boat and given nothing back. As time passed, even that reminder grew faint. The old fishermen who remembered the Annabelle's disappearance eventually stopped speaking of it. For most in the town, it became just another tragedy added to the long history of the sea. A cruel but familiar story of lives lost to the water's unpredictable fury. The tide of memory, like the ocean itself, slowly erased the details, leaving behind only fragments. And then, 18 years later, everything changed. It was September 2011 when 2 hunters, Douglas Howard and Jack Taylor, made their way through a remote stretch of forest near an old creek. It was the kind of place rarely visited, tangled with undergrowth and strewn with fallen branches, far from any marked trail or campsite. They were looking for deer tracks, moving slowly, when Douglas caught sight of something pale through the trees. At first he thought it might have been a fallen log, sun-bleached with age. But as they drew closer, both men stopped in their tracks. What they saw made no sense at all. There, resting neatly between tall pines on a bed of dried needles, was a boat. The shape of its hull was unmistakable, the paint peeling, but the form intact. As they stepped closer, they saw the name still visible on the bow. Annabelle. The very same boat that had vanished at sea nearly 2 decades earlier. It should have been impossible. There was no road leading into this part of the forest, no clear path where such a vessel could have been dragged. The undergrowth was thick, the terrain uneven and swampy in places. The boat appeared almost untouched, as though someone had carefully placed it there, out of the water and into the trees. The hunters were stunned, and with disbelief still written across their faces, they contacted the local sheriff's office. Sheriff Bennett arrived with 3 deputies later that afternoon. They circled the boat cautiously, inspecting it for signs of how it might have come to rest in such an unlikely place. The hull showed no serious damage. There were no drag marks in the soil, no tire tracks, no signs of heavy machinery having passed through. The bottom was level, as though it had simply materialized where it stood. Inside, they found fishing boxes, a canister of fresh water, a life preserver, and even a jacket bearing initials. On a shelf sat a wristwatch that relatives would later confirm had belonged to Mark West. But one detail overshadowed everything else. The men who had once crewed the Annabelle were not there. No bones, no signs of a struggle, no evidence of death, just silence and absence, as though Jonathan and Mark had stepped off the deck and disappeared into thin air. The sheriff's immediate thought was to test whether it could even be physically possible to move the boat into such a location. The nearest old logging road ended 8 kilometers away, and between the boat and that road lay swamps, fallen trees, and thickets too dense for a lorry or a crane to pass through. Even if someone had attempted such a feat, they would have left tracks, gouges in the soil, broken vegetation. But there was nothing. It was as if the Annabelle had defied logic and carried itself into the woods. The discovery sent shock waves through the community. Families who had long since mourned began to hope again, while others feared what the truth might reveal. The Coast Guard confirmed the registration number. It was indeed the same vessel lost at sea in 1993. Yet questions only multiplied. Why had the hull not borne the scars of years in salt water? Where were the signs of decay or corrosion? Why did it look as though the boat had never endured the storm that supposedly claimed it? Relatives arrived soon after, and Jonathan's brother, Harry Hill, recognized his brother's jacket instantly. He also identified Mark's watch, still resting inside. Standing in the forest, he could only shake his head in disbelief. "They were on board," he said quietly. "I don't understand why the boat is here." Investigators launched a new search of the area, but aerial sweeps revealed nothing more. Cameras set up nearby caught only the ordinary movements of deer and other forest animals. It was as if the boat had appeared there overnight, delivered by invisible hands. A tattered logbook found inside bore Jonathan's handwriting, with the final entry reading, "The storm is getting worse, heading southeast. The engine is malfunctioning." The note was dated an hour before the last radio transmission, but the ink had not faded as it should have after 18 years at sea. This was no ordinary discovery. It was the reopening of a wound, the resurrection of a mystery thought long buried. The Annabelle had returned, but it brought with it not closure, only deeper questions. And for every answer the investigators hoped to find, another contradiction waited in the shadows. When the Annabelle was first pulled from the forest clearing and examined in detail, investigators expected to find nothing more than the marks of time-rotted wood, rusted fittings, perhaps traces of salt still lingering from her years at sea. What they found, instead, only deepened the mystery. The boat seemed almost preserved, as though untouched by the violent storm that had supposedly claimed it. Even the fittings were firm, the hull intact. And then, amongst the fishing gear and weathered jackets, came the first of several discoveries that would confound the case for good. Inside one of the drawers, tucked beneath old ropes, was a pocket-knife. At first glance it seemed unremarkable, just another tool that a fisherman might have carried on board. But when examined more closely, the serial number revealed it had been manufactured in 1999, 6 years after the Annabelle vanished. Relatives insisted such an item had never been on board. How then had it come to rest inside a vessel that had disappeared in 1993? This was the first unexplainable piece of evidence, and it shook even the most seasoned investigators. The second was the logbook. Found with its cover battered but its pages intact, it contained Jonathan Hill's last known entry. "The storm is getting worse, heading southeast. The engine is malfunctioning." That line matched the time of the final radio call, yet experts noted something unsettling. The ink had not faded as it should have. Paper that had supposedly been exposed to salt air and damp for nearly 2 decades looked almost fresh, as though the words had been written only a year or two before the boat was found. Chemical analysis later confirmed that the ink was less than 2 years old, a direct contradiction. Either the logbook had been tampered with, or someone had added to it years after Jonathan was presumed lost at sea. These discoveries placed the investigation under a darker light. It was no longer simply a story of a boat lost and found. Something or someone had kept the Annabelle hidden and preserved long after the storm had passed. And then another revelation arrived, one that made the story national news. In a small plastic package hidden beneath a panel, officers found 2 photographs. Grainy amateur shots, but clear enough to identify the faces. It was Jonathan Hill and Mark West. They appeared older, both with beards, and both weary, seated at a wooden table in what looked like a warehouse. The print date stamped on the back was 2009, 16 years after their disappearance. Relatives who were shown the photographs confirmed what investigators already knew. It was them. No doubt. The brothers, unmistakable, alive long after the storm. Yet the setting was strange. A wooden wall behind them, a metal pipe crossing into view. Not a ship, not the sea, but some hidden facility. If the fishermen had been alive in 2009, then where had they been all those years? And more disturbing still, where were they now? The discovery of the photographs turned the investigation on its head. Suddenly, this was no longer a local curiosity, no longer just a mystery for county sheriffs. The Federal Bureau stepped in, bringing with them criminologists, forensic analysts, and specialists in missing persons. The photographs were scrutinized for signs of forgery, but experts declared them genuine. The film stock matched the late 2000s, the emulsion and chemical makeup authentic to that period. No tampering, no digital trickery. They were real. The case, once thought closed, had reopened with terrifying implications. For the families of Jonathan and Mark, it was both a cruel hope and a deepening wound. Their loved ones had survived the storm, but had they lived as free men? The photographs suggested captivity. Exhaustion etched into their faces, a bruise on Jonathan's cheek, the hollow look of men kept against their will. As investigators combed through the boat again, they found more to unsettle them. Beneath loose planking in the hull lay faint traces of blood. Samples were taken, and DNA testing later confirmed it belonged to Mark West. It was the first biological evidence linking the men to the boat after its reappearance. But what did it mean? Had he been injured in the forest, or years earlier in some place they had been held? The forest itself seemed to whisper its secrets reluctantly. An old logging hangar, long abandoned, was discovered 5 kilometers from where the Annabelle had been found. Inside, investigators noted drag marks across the floor, the width and shape eerily matching the keel of the fishing boat. Analysis dated those marks to within the last year before discovery. It was clear. The Annabelle had been stored there, hidden away from the world, only to be dragged into the forest deliberately. But why? And by whom? Soon after, a break came from an unexpected source. A former employee of a private transport company came forward. Under questioning, he admitted that the previous autumn he had been paid in cash to haul an unusual cargo along an old forest track. The cargo, he said, was a boat. He and another driver were supervised by two masked men, warned not to ask questions, and instructed to unload the vessel deep within the forest before leaving at once. When shown a picture of the Annabelle, he confirmed it was the same boat. This testimony shattered any lingering illusion that the Annabelle had somehow drifted inland by natural means. It was proof that she had been moved deliberately, placed like a monument in the woods. But it also introduced darker suspicions. If someone had gone to such lengths, what else had been concealed? With each revelation, the contradictions piled higher. A knife made years after the disappearance. A logbook written with fresh ink. Photographs proving survival into the 2000s. DNA traces where none should be. Testimony of men transporting the boat under cover of night. Nothing fit the official version, and every answer seemed to raise only more questions. For the public, the story became a spectacle. Newspapers across the country ran headlines, "Lost boat found, crew alive?" Talk shows debated the case, some leaning towards a criminal conspiracy, others daring to suggest supernatural explanations. Yet for investigators, the horror was in the details. They were not chasing ghosts, but people, real men who had been alive, who had suffered, and who had likely been silenced. For Jonathan's brother Harry, the pain was sharper than ever. To know his brother had lived through the storm only to vanish again was almost unbearable. They were on board, he had said when he first saw the boat in the woods. Now, he added, they were alive. Someone had them, and someone still knows what happened. The climax of the Annabelle case was not a resolution, but an escalation. With each contradiction, the picture grew darker, the threads leading towards captivity, smuggling, and deliberate concealment. The once simple tragedy of a storm at sea had become a labyrinth of lies and unanswered questions. And the greatest question of all remained. If Jonathan and Mark were alive 16 years after the storm, then where were they now? The discovery of the photographs and the testimony of the transport worker had already transformed the Annabelle case from a local enigma into a federal investigation. Yet, the deeper the agents delved, the more the narrative shifted away from a tragic maritime accident and towards something far darker. An operation that hinted at organized crime, captivity, and the deliberate silencing of witnesses. For months, the FBI pieced together scraps of evidence that seemed to point in an unsettling direction. The fisherman's survival into the late 2000s was no longer speculation but fact. The DNA recovered from the hull, the bruised faces in the photographs, the ink on the logbook all spoke of manipulation and concealment. And then came the suggestion, whispered first among investigators and later spoken aloud. Jonathan and Mark had not simply vanished into the sea. They had been taken. It began with the old logging hangar. The drag marks across the floor told of a boat stored there, kept hidden from prying eyes. But the hangar itself revealed more. Under rotting planks in one corner, fragments of fabric stained with blood were recovered. Forensic tests confirmed the blood belonged to Mark West. This detail alone destroyed the notion of supernatural disappearance. The fishermen had been alive, present in that building at some point, and one of them had been injured. The hangar was not a place of refuge but a prison. Questions multiplied. Who would keep two ordinary fishermen locked away for years? Why preserve the boat rather than destroy it? And why, after nearly 2 decades, move it into a forest clearing where discovery was inevitable? These questions became the framework of the investigation, but every answer seemed to slip further from reach. As agents widened their search, a new thread emerged from maritime archives. Two men, listed as researchers of maritime folklore, had taken an unusual interest in the Annabelle only months before it disappeared. Their names were false, but one alias reappeared in connection with smuggling operations along the Atlantic seaboard. The name was Evans, and it was tied to a group known among investigators as the Northern Cross Group, a shadowy network suspected of trafficking stolen relics, weapons, and contraband through obscure coastal routes since the 1982nd. Suddenly, the picture shifted. The Annabelle might not have been a random victim of the storm. She may have sailed, unknowingly, into the path of smugglers moving illicit cargo. The fishermen, perhaps by chance, had become witnesses. And in such operations, witnesses were a liability. This theory gained weight when Interpol shared files from Morocco. In the mid-1990s, records surfaced of a fishing boat matching the Annabelle's description, offered quietly by a dealer in maritime antiques. The deal never closed, but the reference was enough. Someone had moved the Annabelle across borders, treating it not as wreckage, but as merchandise. The boat itself had become part of the contraband. If this was true, then Jonathan and Mark had likely been kept alive, not out of mercy, but calculation. They could be leveraged, used as bargaining chips, or held in reserve for some unknown purpose. The photographs from 2009 showed them weary but living, suggesting years in captivity. The investigation reached a grim turning point when agents traced an aging associate of the Northern Cross Group to a quiet suburb in the southern United States. His name was Thomas Wilkins, a man who had lived for years under another identity. Detained and confronted with photographs of the Annabelle and the fisherman, Wilkins initially refused to speak. But as hours passed and the weight of evidence pressed upon him, he faltered. Yes, he admitted, the group had intercepted the Annabelle during the storm. Their original target had been another vessel, but when the small fishing boat crossed their path, they seized it. The men aboard were kept alive, not killed, because one of the organizers, Evans, believed they could prove useful. For a time, they were held in the very hangar where investigators would later find traces of blood. Heavy guards, masked men, watchful eyes. The fishermen were broken down slowly, physically and psychologically. Escape was near impossible. Wilkins recalled seeing Mark attempt an escape in 2001. After that, panic spread within the group. Guards tightened. Jonathan was moved to another location, rumored to be a clinic or facility across the border. But Wilkins confessed he no longer knew the full chain of custody. The group had fragmented, some members disappearing, others adopting new names. The smugglers had scattered like shadows. When pressed about the decision to place the Annabelle in the forest, Wilkins hesitated. His words were halting, uncertain. He believed it had been done by a splinter of the group, perhaps as a way to sever ties, perhaps as a message. One of them wanted the world to know, he said, or wanted someone else to pay attention. Yet he could not name who. Before more could be learned, Wilkins was found dead in his cell. The official verdict was suicide. For investigators, it was a devastating twist. A man who had admitted to knowledge of the capture, who had offered glimpses into the fisherman's years of torment, had taken his secrets with him. The trail, once warming, grew cold again. For the families, the revelations were unbearable. To know that Jonathan and Mark had survived, only to be imprisoned and exploited, turned grief into a lingering anguish. The thought of them being so close, alive within reach, but hidden deliberately, was almost too much to bear. Harry Hill, Jonathan's brother, voiced the unspoken horror. The sea didn't take them, people did, and those people decided their lives were worth nothing. Publicly, the case took on an almost cinematic quality. Newspapers called it the boat that lived two lives. Commentators debated whether the smugglers had intended the Annabelle as a decoy, a storage vessel, or simply a discarded piece of evidence. But behind the headlines, investigators wrestled with the more sobering truth. Ordinary men had been drawn into an extraordinary crime, and their fate remained unresolved. The Northern Cross group itself became the focus of renewed scrutiny. Old case files were dusted off, names re-examined. The group, once thought dissolved, now appeared to have left long shadows across decades of unsolved smuggling cases. If they had indeed held the fishermen captive, then the Annabelle was only one piece of a far larger puzzle, one whose missing fragments might never be found. The twist in the Annabelle case was cruel in its simplicity. The fishermen had not been lost to the storm at all. They had been stolen, trapped in a web of crime that reduced their lives to pawns in a game of contraband. The boat, carefully preserved, became both a vessel and a prison, an artifact of smuggling and suffering. And when the group fractured, someone chose to deposit it in a forest clearing, a grotesque monument to unfinished business. Yet the greatest twist of all was Wilkins himself. His confession promised answers, yet his death sealed the silence. Whatever truths he held about Jonathan and Mark, whether either survived beyond 2009, whether their captors ever faced justice, died with him. What remained was a chilling portrait of lives interrupted, not by nature, but by human hands. The Annabelle, once just a small fishing boat from a quiet harbor, now stood as evidence of something far greater. The ability of crime to erase people, to bend reality, to twist the ordinary into the unthinkable. And for those who followed the story, the fear was not only in what had happened, but in what still might lie hidden, waiting to be discovered. The investigation into the Annabelle eventually reached a standstill, its case file left open but unanswered, like so many of the questions it raised. The FBI could not say with certainty whether Jonathan and Mark had perished in captivity, escaped only to vanish again, or whether some trace of them might still linger, hidden in another archive or another forest. What was clear was that their fate had not been decided by the storm alone, but by human choices. Choices steeped in secrecy, smuggling, and silence. Back in the small harbor where their story began, a new photograph was pinned to the pier. No longer just the faded image of the Annabelle, but now accompanied by the faces of the two men who had once sailed her into the sea. Relatives gathered quietly, tears on their cheeks, honoring not only their loss, but the endurance they had shown, surviving years in the shadows before disappearing once more. The boat itself was locked away in federal storage, a relic of a mystery that refused to give up its truth. And so the story ends, not with answers, but with a haunting absence. What do you believe really happened to Jonathan and Mark? Were they prisoners until the very end, or did one of them find freedom, if only for a moment? Share your theory in the comments, and if you want to uncover more mysteries like this one, subscribe to Unknown Stories. The past is never as silent as it seems sometimes. It waits in the dark, asking to be found again.